Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's great to have such a wonderful turnout for such an interesting and exciting public seminar today. There's just one thing I'd like to correct in that intro that Carol gave to you of me. I was very humbled just a moment ago, actually. I saw someone in the audience who I haven't seen for a long time and had no idea they were going to be here. I went to university a long time ago, as you could appreciate, and immunology itself is a relatively young discipline as a field of study and our understanding. And when I was at university, I was doing science and I could choose to do biochemistry, microbiology, or immunology. And biochemistry and microbiology were pretty jaded, and the lecturers were pretty jaded. But my immunology lecturer was this professor who had just moved to the university I was at, who was incredibly inspiring. And it was actually Bob's lectures in those days that inspired me to be an immunologist, I must say. So welcome, Bob. So immunology, it's a wonderful discipline. Probably a lot of you may not understand, appreciate just how dynamic and exciting immunology as a science is and how important our immune system is to us. It's involved in almost every biological process you could imagine, and as I'll show you shortly, and as you'll hear from the talks after mine from Tree and Elisa, when things go wrong, things can really go wrong. But on the other hand, you can really take advantage of the power of the immune system for a greater good, and you'll hear some fantastic examples of that this morning. So, with that slight introduction, sorry, can I have my first slide, Rob? Thanks. So, immunology's got a fantastic history, and as I said, it's a relatively young discipline, and Australia's made fantastic contributions to our understanding of immunology, particularly in the 60s, some work done in Melbourne by a number of giants of immunology. But immunology itself, the name comes from the Latin word immunus, which was a word which was used to describe people who were exempt from particular things, like military service or paying tax or other public service. So it was this sort of description of someone who had a bit of power over other people, or it prevented them, or gave them opportunities to get out of doing things. And that's sort of what the immune system does. It protects you, or insulates you, or allows you to not have to face some things in life which may be less desirable. And of course, those things are infection. And while we've been studying immunology very detailed in the last 60 or so years, the first documented description of immunology is attributed to a Greek historian and philosopher called Thucydides, who was describing in 2,500 years ago, so nearly 500 BC, the devastating effects of a plague that struck during the Peloponnesian War. So this was in Athens, ancient Athens. And he made this fantastic observation that the people who were sick and dying, they were actually looked after by the people who had recovered from the plague. And that was because the people who had recovered knew that they were free from apprehensions. So they had this immunus, essentially. Because what they knew was that if you survived the plague, that they were going to be protected. They didn't know why or how, of course. And this famous statement was that for no one was ever attacked a second time, at least not fatally. And that really pretty much sums up what the immune system's all about. Many people in this audience, myself included, remembers our childhood getting infectious diseases. I vividly recall missing out on a really important school excursion when I was about 7 years of age because I woke up with a chicken pox. But I've never had chicken pox again. I remember getting mumps and measles, but again, you never get these diseases again unless you're unlucky, of course. And it's amazing for me, who has 3 relatively young kids, who know that they can be vaccinated against 26 or 27 different types of infectious diseases, and more than likely they're going to be protected against those infections. I got those infections and I'm protected for life, more or less. My kids can be immunised today and they won't have to experience chickenpox, measles, mumps, rubella, and so on. And that's really what this guy was talking about. If you were exposed to something and you survived, you were pretty likely to be protected for the rest of your life. And I think that's a pretty amazing biological process, that your body somehow remembers insults that it experiences from infectious diseases and is powered to protect you for life, exempting you from something pretty undesirable. So, what is the immune system? Like many systems in our body, it's something which you don't really appreciate, I think, until something goes wrong. So right now, probably many of you are fighting infections which are not actually causing you to be unwell yet. So the main role of our immune system is, of course, to protect you against infection. bacteria, viruses, pathogens. We hear about influenza, seasonal influenza, and you hear about lots of emerging different types of infections. So our immune system is designed to keep us healthy, essentially, like many other things in our body. And this prevents us from different types of infections. And as I said, this is really taken advantage of in the context of vaccination. Our immune system is also very important because it can protect us against tumours and cancers to a point. And I'll talk about that a bit more, and Tree will touch upon that in more detail as well. So this is what the immune system is always looking for. Different types of bacteria, different types of fungi, different types of viruses, different types of parasites. So the immune system is really guarding us from bad pathogens that are out there, and of course can cause horrible diseases. So the immune system is comprised of many different types of cells. These cells are essentially circulating in our body and our bloodstream, but they also localise in different tissues. So you'd appreciate when you go to the doctor, you've got a sore throat, they'll often feel your neck or under your arms because they're looking for inflamed lymph nodes. And that's what the immune system does. It causes these inflammatory responses. We have lots of immune cells rushing into a particular site, causes that swelling, that redness that you're familiar with. And that's actually a good thing because it tells you your body is responding to an infection, or you might have trodden on that rusty nail in the backyard, and your body's protecting you against tetanus infection, for example. And your cells are rushing to the site to do things. And then once they're there, different types of immune cells can do different types of important jobs. So B cells, which is what I've been studying for many, many years, produce proteins called antibodies. And antibodies are these soluble proteins which bind to different pathogens, and they're sort of flags. They flag the immune system that something is on the premises and shouldn't be around. So when the immune system really becomes that sort of sentinel force, that your armed forces, to look for what shouldn't be there and clear it out. So antibodies do that. We've got other types of cells called killer cells, which, not surprisingly, kill cells, and they're very important for protecting us against viruses. Viruses are very clever. Viruses hide from the immune system by actually living in our cells. So viruses infect particular cells, and then they live in those cells, and they're sort of protected from the immune system by our own cells. But there are ways that the immune system can find them, and again, when a cell gets infected, it puts a little signal out and tells the immune system, hang on, there's something not right here. So we'll look after those cells and get rid of them. And there's other cells which just come along and chomp along and chew up lots of debris or other bacteria or so on that shouldn't be around to clear things out. So there's all different types of immune cells which work together in a real coordinated team-like effort to keep us healthy and protect us from disease. So this is a remarkable figure. It actually shows the lifespan of humans over not just decades, but centuries and even millennia. So you can see, if you follow these graphs here, which are all pretty much on top of each other, this describes the lifespan of prehistoric man, 10,000 years before the modern era, 3,000 years, a couple of hundred years ago, in different countries. And you can see there's not a lot of difference. So if you look at this here, about 50% of people died before they were 30. Either a couple of hundred years ago in the UK, for example, or 10,000 years ago. So these rates of survival haven't really changed much until quite recently. And that's pretty remarkable, I think. I'm 46, so if I was living a couple of hundred years ago, there was probably a 50% chance that I wouldn't be here. But you can see here now, taken from a decade and a half ago, and it's probably slightly improved again in the last 15 years, as you know, lifespan is fantastic. 80, 90-year-old plus. With the extended lifespan now, what has happened? We haven't evolved dramatically to suddenly become this organism which can protect ourselves against infection, which was wiping out the population quite rapidly not that long ago. What has changed? You can also see, regrettably, this isn't universal, of course. If you live in not developed countries, or probably even underdeveloped parts of Indigenous Australia, you would have a less survival curve. But the point here is, over 200 years, from 1800s to 2000, there's been this doubling of our lifespan. So how does it happen? It's not evolution, it's something else. Oops, sorry. So three things have happened, which all involve the immune system. One is the simple concept of hygiene. washing your hands makes a huge difference, as you would probably know. You always tell yourselves and your children and your grandchildren to wash your hands, which is not a bad thing. The other was the development of antibiotics in the 1900s, of course, the development of penicillin and so on, that affected infectious disease, and vaccination. So there's three things: a social change of cleanliness, an introduction of antibiotics, which prevented or controlled infection, and vaccination, which in often cases prevented infection, as opposed to just controlling it by antibiotics. So those three things have combined to result in this huge increase in lifespan over the last 200 years. So just to give you some examples of this, success of vaccination. These are cases of polio in the top here, and meningococcal disease, which is a pretty horrible invasive bacterial disease. Going back to the 1940s here, you can see the numbers of cases, this is in Australia, of polio were increasing dramatically in the 40s and 50s, and then when the vaccine was introduced in the mid-50s, the number of cases of polio declined to the point now where you rarely hear of polio, at least in Australia. There are some parts in the world where polio is still a problem, but it's very rare to hear of polio outbreaks in Australia. And likewise, this was a bit later because we didn't have this vaccine until about 15 years ago or so, but again, the numbers of cases of meningococcal disease increased during the 90s, and then when we got the vaccine, it drops off, which is remarkable. And of course, this has also resulted in the eradication of some pathogens, like smallpox is deemed to be eradicated from the planet, which is just remarkable. So this intervention, really since the 1800s, of inoculating people with mild forms of infection or heat-killed versions of these pathogens, has had this fantastic effect on longevity. And we see this for many, many different pathogens and so on these days. So, so vaccination obviously has had a huge impact on society and on the socio-economic status of the world. And you may have heard a lot about cancer immunotherapy. Tree's going to talk about this in more detail shortly after the break. But cancer immunotherapy, I think as immunologists, we've known the immune system has been very important in protecting you against cancer for decades. Unfortunately, not many people believed us. The oncologists were not that convinced. They thought, we'll just keep treating cancer with chemotherapy, with horrible drugs which cause dreadful side effects. But as immunologists, we knew there was a role for the immune system because you could often get cancer if you were immunosuppressed. So people who had transplants or were on immunosuppressive therapy, the incidence of malignancy in those individuals was greatly increased. So we knew the immune system did something. And there was lots of ideas of how that operated. But we've seen in the last couple of years, literally, and almost monthly now, these fantastic reports from clinical trials of immuno-oncology or cancer immunotherapy or checkpoint inhibitors. These are these words that you may have heard in the press, where we're harnessing the power of the immune system and unleashing that ability to kill cells, to recognize things that shouldn't be there, to recognize parts of your body that are foreign, and they're having fantastic outcomes and durable outcomes in protecting against cancer. And Tree will go into that in a little bit more detail shortly. But as I said, it's not all good. It's Newton's law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. While the immune system operates fantastically, normally, when you get infection, it has an immune response. When you have vaccination, you can prevent infection. Things can go wrong. And there's a plethora of conditions which you may not appreciate are actually caused by problems with the immune system. So these take many shapes and forms. Asthma and allergy, as Carol was mentioning a moment ago. Asthma and allergy, they're certainly on the rise in Western societies. We hear much, much more about problems with allergies in kids, for example, peanut allergy, bee sting allergies, all sorts of allergies to different types of foods. That's an immune-mediated problem. And then there's, of course, autoimmune diseases. Now, there's about 80 different autoimmune diseases, and Elisa will talk about this a little while shortly. And a bit like cancer, there's not just one type of autoimmune disease. There's all these different types. They can affect most parts of the body. And this is what I find remarkable about immunology. To understand almost every disease, you've got to understand immunology. So, for example, multiple sclerosis, that is the immune system attacking the nervous system. Diabetes is the immune system attacking the pancreas or the endocrine system. Rheumatoid arthritis is where the immune system attacks the musculoskeletal system. And things like inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's disease, colitis, this is where the immune system takes on the gastrointestinal tract. So the immune system, because it's such a mobile system, it's floating, circulating in our blood, trafficking through our body all the time, no tissue is really immune, for want of a better word, from attack. So there's lots of autoimmune diseases, and many of you may know people with autoimmune diseases. And what's very interesting about this, it's much more common in females. For some diseases, the ratio of men to women, it affects maybe 5 to 10 times more females than it does males, and that's something we don't really have a clear handle on. There's improvements in understanding and treatments of these, but autoimmune disease, as I said, you could be seeing a rheumatologist, you could see an endocrinologist, you could see a neurologist, but these all stem back to problems with the immune system. So we've really got to understand what the immune system does to get to the root of some of these diseases. Cancer, as I mentioned, tumour surveillance, looking for cancers is an important role of the immune system, but there's also malignancies of the immune system, so leukemias, lymphomas, myeloma. These are all malignancies of different types of cells of the immune system. So again, understanding how normal immune cells work can tell us maybe what goes wrong to make them malignant in that first case. And then immunodeficiencies, and this is what my lab's been working on for many years now. And this can take the form of genetic immunodeficiencies, which is what I'm interested in, but also acquired immunodeficiency. Of course, the most famous one is HIV, AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which is where your immune system stops working properly, and as a result, you become very susceptible to infectious diseases and also to cancer. So this is an area that my work has focused on for many, many years now, really since I finished my PhD and when I worked overseas for a little while, so nearly 20 years now. These are called primary immunodeficiencies. These are called experiments of nature. And these are essentially conditions which arise in very rare individuals, and that's because they have an error in a single gene. So in our genome, in our DNA, we have 20 or 25,000 different genes which function across the entire body in different systems. Some genes are more active in some systems, some in others. In the immune system, there's believed to be about 2,000 genes, 2,000 to 3,000 genes that are important for immunity. And at the moment, we've identified errors or mutations in about 300 of these genes, which give rise to unique conditions, different primary immunodeficiencies. So because these are genetic and often inherited, the conditions present very early on. So these often strike not long after birth or in the neonatal or infant period. They're incredibly rare. So they affect maybe 1 in 50,000 on average, 1 in 50 to 60,000, to being extremely rare. And when I mean extremely rare, we have worked with some colleagues overseas on literally one individual in the world who has one mutation. More of those patients will probably come available over time, but they can literally be incredibly unique individuals. So they're rare, but very informative. So we study these, although these are rare individuals, and when you talk about something like autoimmune disease, which may affect, say, 1 in 20 people, 1 in 20, not 1 in 25,000, it's often I go to great lengths to justify what I do, because ostensibly my work may only affect, at face value, a couple of people, but it actually has huge ramifications for other disciplines and other aspects of science and immunology and medicine. So if we can find out what what gene has a mistake in it or a mutation, that can provide an explanation for why they have that disease, how that disease progresses. Importantly, it can actually diagnose the condition, so you know exactly what is wrong, and that's important not just for the patient, but maybe for the family if there's other potentially affected kids. It can understand what that gene does normally, and it can also be complemented to actually help us develop new therapies or new treatments for these conditions. But also, it can help develop drugs for conditions that are like this one, but ones that are more common in the general population. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. So, to highlight the relevance of primary immunodeficiencies, I'm going to tell you a story about 2 boys. There's this little kid here. He's about 7 in this photo. He was born in 1970 in the southern suburbs of Sydney. And he was a regular kid, grew up in a suburban family, did all those things that kids do, played soccer, rolled around in the dirt, got sick, got better. Didn't quite become the big wave surfer that he dreamt of, but went on to be pretty happy as an immunologist. And there's this little kid here who was born not long after him in the southern states of the US, and his name's David Vetter. He was born in 1971, And for almost every day of his 12 and a half years, he lived in a bubble. He was the boy in the bubble, who was immortalised in film and popular culture. But tragically, he spent all of his life in a bubble. You could argue the merits of that socially and morally, of course. But that was an intervention taken because his parents had a son born a few years before that who died of a horrible infectious disease very shortly after birth. So this was late 60s, early 70s. We didn't really know much about immunology. We almost knew nothing about bone marrow transplantation, for example. So the doctors made the decision that if the parents had another boy, or he was likely to be sick, so they put him in a bubble. And he lived for 12 and a half years, which in itself is remarkable, showing you that if you live in a sterile environment, you can be protected from pathogens. However, he did die when he was 12 and a half for various complications. But what came from that, the difference between these two kids is essentially one gene. He could not have physical contact with his mum at all. He did that once, and then they put him in a bubble, and they did it again when he was dying. So, whereas this little guy, it didn't matter if he, ate dirt, he was fine. So this highlights the importance of the immune system. As I said, it's sort of taken for granted until something goes catastrophically wrong. And he had one mutation in one gene, which pretty much wiped out his immune system. Stopped it functioning, made him incredibly susceptible to almost every pathogen you could imagine. Like it or not, our skin is covered in bacteria. Not a nice thought, but it's reality. Pathogens are everywhere. Our immune system is on all the time, protecting us from infections. But if you can't do that, there are problems. So what my lab does, in one aspect of it, is we study infection in boys like David, actually, rare individuals who have a disease called X-linked lymphoproliferative disease. And this is X-linked, which means it's carried by mums and passed on only to their sons. So the mothers are healthy, but the sons are affected. And in this case, this is a fascinating disease. The kids are usually healthy in their first couple of years of life until they're exposed to a virus, which everyone in this room has probably been exposed to, and that's called Epstein-Barr virus. It's a virus. It's a herpes virus, so it's like some other viruses, like chickenpox virus, and it causes a disease called infectious mononucleosis, which is better known as glandular fever. So most people get EBV infection. Not many people actually get sick. Only about 25%. I unfortunately was one of those people who got glandular fever. In fact, when I was doing my honours year, many years ago. So these boys are very vulnerable to infection with Epstein-Barr virus. In fact, they're essentially a time bomb. So if they're not known to have this disease or this gene, they can be happy, healthy, but then when they get to be between 3 and 5 years old, when you're likely to get exposed to this virus, their immune system just goes off and they can have catastrophic outcomes. So you can imagine that's pretty shocking in a family who've had no family history of this condition. Suddenly they've got a healthy kid and suddenly they don't. And we've worked with a lot of families where there's been numerous boys affected over generations actually. And the first times you talk about this, it's terrifying because they have a healthy kid. You're talking to them about having a healthy child, but he's actually not healthy. He is a time bomb and he's going to go off when you don't expect it. And discussing that with families, not that I'm not a clinician, so I don't have these discussions literally, it's confronting because you need to tell them that you need to do something about this quickly, otherwise your son or nephew or grandson is going to have a dreadful outcome. So we've been working on this disease for nearly 20 years now, and we've made lots of exciting discoveries about this. So what do? We actually work with kids and their families, and lots of clinicians around Australia and beyond actually. We look in their blood cells. So these are different types of cells that you can take out of tissues or their circulation. We look for proteins that are expressed in these cells, and you can see these are a bunch of these patients, and these patients lack this protein. It's this protein right here. So it's absent from these kids. And then we can sequence their DNA and look to see what the mutation is and why that's causing disease. So EBV, as I said, it's a fascinating disease because most people in this room have probably been exposed to EBV. A small number of you may have been sick by it, but it's remarkable. So this raises the question of, well, okay, I'm working on these rare diseases. How can this actually help the large population? And the answer to that is shown here. EBV, it causes some disease, infectious mononucleosis, as I said. It's also called mono, the kissing disease. You don't have to guess why it's called that. XLP, which is what I work on. But actually, EBV, although I'm sort of saying it doesn't affect many people, it's actually the first described virus that causes cancer. So in the 60s, it was reported to be what's called an oncovirus, meaning cancer-causing. And to date, there's 7 different malignancies that are associated or directly caused by Epstein-Barr virus. And this usually happens in immunosuppressed individuals, or it happens in some geographically restricted areas. So you've probably heard of Burkitt's lymphoma, Hodgkin's lymphoma, B-cell lymphoma. You may not have heard of nasopharyngeal carcinoma or leiomyosarcoma. But still, these are malignancies that affect a significant number of people at different stages of their life, and they're often caused by EBV. So my studies into these rare individuals who cannot control EBV infection tell us exactly what molecules the immune system needs, what signals have to be communicated to one cell to another, and how to build an immune response against EBV. And we can use that information and translate it to different scenarios of the larger population, whereby that information will be useful to improve the immune system of other people so that they can have better outcomes for EBV infection. And not that we are doing this specifically, but as I said, EBV causes cancer. And you'd all be familiar with Gardasil. This is the vaccine that prevents cervical cancer. So Gardasil doesn't actually prevent cervical cancer directly. It prevents cervical cancer because it's a vaccine against human papillomavirus, which is also a cancer-causing virus. So if we can understand Epstein-Barr virus a little bit better, ideally, it would be great to be able to develop a vaccine, because there isn't a successful one at the moment. There's been lots of efforts, but there's no vaccine against EBV. So it'd be wonderful to think that the research that I'm doing could contribute to preventing EBV disease in the greater community, and possibly by contributing to the development of a vaccine, which could also be a vaccine that prevented cancer. So what else is there about immunology that we should be studying? There's loads of exciting stuff out there. Over the last 15 years, we often hear in the press about these emerging diseases. So most recently, there was a lot of flurry about, and quite justifiably, Zika virus. No cases, I don't think, were seriously reported in Australia. There might have been one in Brisbane, come to think of it. But that was very popular in the press. I think the biggest stories were whether the Australian Olympic team should go to South America, because there was significant issues with the Zika virus there. But that was very problematic. Ebola virus comes and goes from the press, but again, these are devastating, often fatal infections, which we have no serious control over at the moment. And then there's been long-term infections, malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. These we still don't have vaccines for, although we've been working very, very hard on this for decades. And then there's these other conditions which I've talked a little bit about, and you'll hear more about now. So the immune system's a dynamic, versatile machine which protects us against infection, but there can always be room for improvement, just like anything else. We can improve protection in immunity against infection. We can try to understand diseases better, and we can harness the immune system to help treat cancer. And I think that was my last slide. Yes. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your time. And I think Carol's going to come back now and talk about the foundation. Thank you very much.